So, last year, I discovered this website called Backloggd, and it's since then become like my favorite new thing on the internet. Back in 2019, I thought, hey, wouldn't it be cool if I ranked every game I owned from best to worst? But before I could do that, I had to list every game I owned. So I made a spreadsheet, and I cataloged every game I owned by console. Then, once I had that, I went through it ranking every single game I owned. The system was functional, but after a while it became a bit cumbersome to have to manually update the spreadsheet every time I bought a new game. Then come January 2022, and suddenly there's this website with its own pre-made database that could do it all for me. With Backloggd's built-in calendar and list systems, I finally felt motivated to keep track of all the games I played in 2022. And so here we are, a video compilation of the Backloggd reviews I wrote for the games I played this year. Notably, this is not exclusively a list of games that released in 2022, because then this video wouldn't even be a top 5. Instead, it's a list of all the games I finished for the first time this year, plus one game that I dropped but don't plan on going back to, so I feel comfortable giving my review for it. I already play more old games than new releases anyway, so frankly it's just more interesting this way, but especially so this year, because I barely played any new releases. There are a few games that I started this year that I haven't finished playing yet, so I won't be discussing those here and will instead be talking about them whatever year I finish them, because I will hopefully be making this a yearly thing. So, before we get into the games I played for the first time, let's quickly run through the games I replayed. So, I would consider myself to have been a fan of the Professor Layton series for quite a while now, but thinking about it, I didn't actually play very many of the games until recently when I was making an active effort to buy and play through all of those older DS Layton games. One of the games I did own when I was first getting into the series was Professor Layton and the Azaran Legacy, but unfortunately, I lost that because I owned it digitally, and when my 3DS broke, I also lost access to the game. Wanting to get the game back for collection purposes, and also because I hadn't played it in a while and wanted to see if it held up, I was hoping to find a used copy, but unfortunately, used copies of this game are ridiculously expensive. So instead I just bought another digital copy, and we'll have to hope that my new 3DS doesn't break because the eShop is closing. Unfortunately, the game wasn't quite as good as I remembered it being, but, you know, I still enjoyed it a good amount, so I would give it an overall recommendation. And also just in general, try out the Professor Layton series. It's a really great series that is unfortunately seemingly dead, but it doesn't mean the games that are there aren't worth trying. So if you're into weird stories and logic puzzles, I would definitely recommend giving it a try. Having done an all side quest run of Xenoblade Chronicles 2 and very much enjoying it, I intended to do the same for the first game at some point, and when Xenoblade Chronicles 3 was announced earlier in the year, it seemed like the perfect opportunity. Unfortunately, the first game's quests are nowhere near as good as the second game's quests. It's a lot of just running back and forth and collecting stuff, fillery, things like that. Still, despite the side quests not being nearly as mentally stimulating, they were fun enough time killers, and the story is just as great the second time around, so I can't complain too much. I mostly just played this one again as a story refresher, since I already did all the quests and it was supposed to contain some foreshadowing for 3. Future Connected is honestly pretty mediocre, but you know, I mean it's still more Xenoblade, so I enjoyed it well enough. Azaran Legacy wasn't the only game I lost when my old 3DS broke, so when the eShop closure was announced, this was one of the many old favorites that I repurchased. I didn't enjoy it quite as much as I remembered, but you know, it was still enjoyable enough to get me through to the credits. Earthbound is probably my favorite game of all time, so when it was finally announced to be coming to Nintendo Switch Online, in the same direct as Xenoblade Chronicles 3 might I add, I was ecstatic. I played the first couple hours when it dropped in February, and then played the rest of it over the summer after finishing Xenoblade Chronicles 3. I don't have any new insights to share, this is just a PSA to go play Earthbound. And finally, for my last replay of the year, after finishing Xenoblade Chronicles 3 for the first time, I went right into a New Game Plus playthrough. I'll give my full review on that later in the video. And now for the games I actually did play for the first time this year. I gave Toree 3D a shot because I kept hearing how good it was for the $1 price tag. While I can't refute that it's certainly more well constructed than most other games at that price tag, I personally wouldn't pay any more for it. I'm not really a big fan of how floaty the physics are. The lack of tight controls makes it tough to collect all the stars at the brisk pace of the auto-scroll levels. You could argue that that's intentional and part of the challenge, but challenges should be something satisfying to overcome, and constantly missing the same jump over and over again wasn't particularly satisfying. That's a big issue, because with the game being as short as it is, collecting the stars and running through the stages is pretty much the entire game. And when controlling a platformer isn't particularly fun, that's kind of a death sentence for your game. The aesthetic is neat, but that's about it, unfortunately. At first I got bored with Pokemon Battle Trozei because I thought the game was too mechanically simple. There aren't any restrictions on how you can move Pokemon around the board, and there isn't much strategy involved in just lining up 3 of a kind. However, when the game gets a little more difficult later on, it does become beneficial to try and line up 5 or 6 of a kind to launch a scatter attack. This allows you to hit multiple enemies at once, so you can clear sections quicker and not take as much damage in the build-up to the boss encounters, so that does add an amount of strategy. Additionally, it is really satisfying clearing the board when the Trozei chance activates. Even then though, the game is still kind of slow, so it's a pretty standard match 3 type game. Nothing particularly noteworthy about it. In concept, Death and Taxes has you make a lot of difficult choices, which should lead to a really interesting overall experience, but in practice, I found it kind of hard to see how your choices mattered. I could tell that broadly obeying or disobeying had some kind of overall effect, but the individual choices didn't seem to change much, something that I think was sort of inherently implied by the premise. The interactions with Fate and the cat were decently entertaining, and like I said, the general concept was pretty good, so I didn't hate the game, but there was a definite lull in the middle where my enjoyment waned a bit. Thankfully, the narrative did start to pick up again at the very end, but at that point it was kind of too late to save the story. I did enjoy the lounge jazz sound of the soundtrack, though. Pokémon Legends Arceus is a game that, while good enough, isn't quite great. The main selling point of this new entry is the new gameplay loop that deviates from the usual Pokémon formula by emphasizing the catching of Pokémon in order to increase your rank and unlock new areas. This is a great idea, and just throwing Pokeballs at a bunch of Pokémon to catch them is a ton of fun, but the actual process of obtaining those Pokeballs is a bit more tedious. Since Pokeballs are a depletable resource, you'll either need to buy or craft them. The game doesn't give you many tumblestones to craft them with, so it's much more efficient to buy in bulk than craft in bulk. You earn money to buy these Pokeballs by catching Pokemon. The problem is that wild Pokemon in this game, at least in my experience, tend to break out of Pokeballs more often than in previous games, and as such, you'll often find yourself at a Pokeball deficit. This can become annoying when you have to catch enough Pokemon to boost your rank and unlock the next area, a process which itself feels like an arbitrary barrier to story progress. Additionally, as more of a personal aside, the mass capturing of Pokemon in this game sort of de-emphasizes the team building aspect, which is my favorite part of the series, and thus was not a change I was particularly fond of. As for things the gameplay does right, as mentioned above, the actual action of catching Pokemon is pretty fun, but by far my favorite aspect of the gameplay are the Alpha Pokemon. Alpha Pokemon are basically just bigger, over-leveled versions of normal Pokemon, and the game lets you challenge them no matter how under-leveled you are. It's actually possible to catch these Pokemon even when you're 5 to 10 levels below them, and so you end up with this sort of fighting Guardians in Breath of the Wild type moment, where you're just trying to keep your team together and get the Pokemon just weak enough in order to catch it. And when you do, it is so satisfying, because then you get the reward of actually being able to use them on your team. In terms of the game's writing, while the story is nothing to write home about, the characters, with a small handful of exceptions, are among the better group of characters in Pokemon's large and storied cast. They turn the hamminess up to 11, and so you get these really over-the-top expressions and snarky characters, sort of reminiscent of the Pokemon anime. This I found was a pleasant surprise. Finally, I feel like I should mention, this game is really ugly, especially the textures, some of which are extremely blurry, but for some reason are still displayed prominently in the environment and on the character models, particularly the Team Galaxy logo. Normally this stuff doesn't bother me too much, it didn't really with Sword and Shield, but here it's just bad. Side note, I wrote this review around the time Legends Arceus first came out, and somehow Scarlet and Violet look worse. They are actually in contention for maybe the ugliest game I've ever played. Scarlet and Violet aren't on this list because I haven't finished them yet, but with hindsight I actually might have reserved this comment for those games instead. Overall, Pokemon Legends Arceus is a good but not great attempt on Game Freak's part to try and change up the Pokemon formula. I do hope that they stick with this gameplay style for future games and try to improve upon it, because the gameplay absolutely does have its moments, it's just not consistent enough in its execution. I love the original Pokémon Snap, but for whatever reason, new Pokémon Snap didn't really click with me. If I had to hazard a guess as to why, and this might sound like a bit of an odd complaint, but I think the game is too long. Hear me out. The original Pokémon Snap is short and sweet, taking about 5 hours to beat, maybe even a little less than that. This game's main campaign runs at about twice as long, at around 10 hours. In theory, this should be a good thing, it's twice as much Pokémon Snap. The problem is, that's all it is, a longer, prettier Pokémon Snap. Your toolset here is almost identical to that of your toolset in the original, the only difference being that the smoke ball is replaced with Illumina orbs. The game doesn't add any new mechanics to supplement the additional 5 hours of gameplay, so as a result the main gameplay loop stagnates pretty quickly. It's still fun in short bursts, but the novelty of the Pokémon Snap concept ends up wearing off too quickly to justify the sequel's total length. I just want to start out by saying that even though this is the one game on the list I didn't see through to completion, I did enjoy it for the most part. For one, I really enjoyed Tandor as a region. Most of the different areas, while still fitting within the normal Pokemon area archetypes, felt a bit more interesting and detailed than they usually do, just on an aesthetic level. I also appreciated the increased emphasis on story, and all the references to the Pokemon Ranger series. Great spin-offs, by the way. It's unfortunate then that the game is plagued by a bit of a balancing issue. I was already underleveled pretty early on, but by the time I finished the 6th gym, for which I already had to grind my starter like 7 levels just to beat, I saw that the next gym jumped a whole 10 levels, and my patience kind of wore out at that point. By that time, it already felt like the game should have ended like 5 hours ago, so realizing I would have to spend another 5 hours or so just grinding without even progressing the story kind of caused me to lose interest. Honestly, if this game was better balanced, I'd probably have ranked it higher and said it was better than any of the mainline Gen 8 games, which honestly it kind of is, but that's besides the point. But a game has to be either really special or have an extremely streamlined combat system to make me put up with grinding that much, and Pokémon Uranium unfortunately doesn't quite reach either qualification. Base game 3D World is alright. It's just a solid platform to kill some time with, which is basically what I'm looking for in a Mario game, even if it's nothing too special. But unfortunately, I just don't have that much to say about it. Bowser's Fury, on the other hand. I think I've only ever played Solitaire once in my life, if that, before picking up this game. As it turns out, I quite enjoy Solitaire. I didn't end up going for all of the cups, but for a week or two the game really sucked me in with the satisfying structure of the races, the strategic field placement of your horse supplementing the Solitaire. Bowser's Fury is great. I'm not sure whose idea it was to put the Odyssey DLC in the 3D World port, but hey, I'll take it. My only complaint is that the Fury Bowser sections were starting to get a bit annoying towards the end. I just want to do some platforming, not play a stealth game. But the open level design easily makes up for it. I'd love to see a bigger, more fully realized version of this game with maybe some less repetitive cat shines. It's kind of hard to explain what makes 5D chess with multiverse time travel so good because frankly, it's too chaotic for me to really understand any of it. Therefore, I'll instead be showing some footage of my co-host Bobbin and I playing the game as a bit of a demonstration. Just a normal game of chess. Totally average, nothing to see here.
Kind of my favorite idea. It's horrifying when you bring up the time travel menu with the queen. I just double checked you.
Double check, that's double check mate, man.
That was the
wrong move.
Interesting move. I think it would have been a good one.
Oh, hey, well, I can do this. I love this game. To be honest, I still don't understand the hype behind the Splatoon single-player modes. People always hype them up as great single-player campaigns for multiplayer games, but that's the thing. It's good for a single-player campaign in a multiplayer game, but it's not nearly good enough to be a selling point. More like just a nice bonus. The ending sequence was great, but there's really not much build-up to it. The gameplay is still rock solid though, especially in the multiplayer. I haven't gotten to play online all too much yet, and when I do, it tends to disconnect pretty often, which is why I would still say I prefer 2 to 3, even though 3 is probably a better game on a technical. Miles Edgeworth Ace Attorney Investigations at its core is just another example of Ace Attorney's winning formula, or perhaps more accurately, its winning writing style. Even without Trials or its main protagonist, the dialogue and character interactions still manage to be thoroughly compelling and entertaining, which carries the game for its first 3 cases while it sets up the major plot beats for the final 2. To get more into specifics, I really liked how cases 4 and 5 kind of tied everything together. At first, I was having a hard time figuring out the significance of the smuggling ring to the overall story. It kept being mentioned, but at first it didn't really seem to affect anything. The way Case 5 unveiled all its twists though made the whole thing feel cohesive and satisfying, also aided by the fact that the whole game, save for one case, takes place over like 3 or 4 days. Also, just as an aside, this game definitely has the best pursuit theme in the series, which definitely boosts it up a point or two. As for things I didn't like as much, I do think Edgeworth felt slightly out of character at times. Admittedly, part of this is inevitable on account of him filling the role of protagonist rather than antagonist, but seeing him just stand up for people he has no prior connection to for seemingly no reason at times made him seem more like a smug Phoenix Wright rather than Miles Edgeworth. Additionally, there were a couple points, particularly during Case 4, where it just felt like the game was creating unnecessary or unproductive conflict just to extend the runtime. And finally, this is maybe a bit nitpicky, but Gumshoe is my favorite Ace Attorney character, and man did they do him dirty in this game. He's written as almost totally incompetent and useless up until the final case, which I think is a bit of a disservice to his character. Overall though, even if not totally necessary, this game is still a thoroughly enjoyable entry to the Ace Attorney canon. At its core, Inscryption is built around 2 really solid foundational elements that hold up the entire experience: the well-designed card gameplay and the engaging meta-narrative. Mechanically, the Inscryption card game is a ton of fun. I think it provides a good balance between strategy and luck with the various card cost mechanics and the ways that you're able to influence your deck by powering up cards in the overworld. I hope one day they make an actual physical Inscryption card game because I would totally buy that. The meta-narrative, which pops up at various points throughout the game, unfolds a lot like a lost cartoon episode or cursed game cartridge creepypasta. And while I can't say that I'm particularly a fan of creepypastas, I do think as the premise for a video game it works really well. By the end of the game, I was invested in Luke Carter's storyline, and seeing how his story ended was a genuinely jaw-dropping moment of shock. My main issue with the game is how the card game is fitted into the context of a video game. As the game is split into 3 distinct sections, a roguelike, an RPG, and what I think is best described as a dungeon crawler, the Inscryption card game then has to try and fit itself into these 3 different frameworks. I don't think the Inscryption card game works particularly well as a roguelike, as it can be a bit tedious having to fight the same early game bosses and enemies to get back to the point where you left off. However, Act 1 also has the best version of the card game, as the rules of the card game are tweaked slightly for each act, with the most straightforward mechanics and the most satisfying deck customization options in the form of death cards, which allow you to make completely broken cards when you die based on the cards you found randomly throughout that run. Nor do I think the card game works particularly well during the RPG of Act 2. A lot of changes are made to the card game's mechanics during Act 2, and the game doesn't really bother to explain them to you, leading to a good amount of initial confusion. The Act 3 Dungeon Crawler is the framework where I think the card game finally seems to fit in properly, as you get the same satisfaction of finding an overworld upgrade as you do in Act 1, but without the RNG that could throw you into fights your deck isn't prepared for. However, Act 3 also removes the blood and bone mechanics from Acts 1 and 2, which were some of the most strategically compelling parts of the card game. I feel like a version of Inscryption with the card and card upgrade mechanics of Act 1, the aesthetics of Act 2, and the exploration of Act 3 would be my ideal version of the game. As one last small nitpick, I wish the game left its story a little less up to interpretation. The game spends most of its runtime carefully building up the meta-narrative, which quickly unravels in the last 30 minutes. And as previously mentioned, that unraveling is very effective at conveying a sense of shock to the player, but it doesn't leave a ton of time for explanation. Even if you do dig into the post-game lore and associated ARG, you still never get a clear explanation on what the old data is, just where it comes from. In that area, I would have liked slightly more closure. I already kind of went into some vague spoilers with this review section, so I'd like to not spoil it any further. It's kind of hard to talk about why Inscryption is so good without getting into the nitty-gritty of the plot, but suffice it to say, it's a very good deck-building roguelike, and those little horror influences really help it to stand out. Poor performance isn't really something that bothers me in games, provided that the game isn't literally unplayable because of it, so the minor frame rate issues and somewhat poor graphics of Rune Factory 5 never really got in the way of my enjoyment of the game. With another charming cast, combat that has been well translated into 3D from Rune Factory 4, and a story that felt more engaging than the ones from the other Rune Factory games that I've played, Rune Factory 5 continues to show how modern Rune Factory is some of the most fun that the farming sim genre has to offer. My only real complaint with this game is how, in removing a lot of the grinding present in the previous entry, the main gameplay loop becomes somewhat less satisfying, as it is no longer urgent to be constantly crafting better weapons and armor to progress with the story. Normally I'm all for streamlining gameplay and cutting down on grinding, but the grinding is part of what made Rune Factory 4 so fun, so to see it be toned down here is somewhat bittersweet. I think the most apt summary I could give of Katamari Damacy is that it's gaming's weirdest power fantasy. To say a little bit more about it than that though, it's one of the most unique games I've ever played. I really can't compare it to anything else. We're talking Pokemon Ranger levels of, this should not be a fun gameplay concept, but gosh darn, they made it work. It's hard to describe why exactly Katamari is a fun game. All I can really say is that once your Katamari reaches 20 meters, you become an unstoppable force of mass destruction, placing you far past any point of reflection where you realized how messed up what you're actually doing is. The final level and credits sequence are particularly satisfying in this regard. I do have some gripes with the game though. Firstly, I wish that it had normal movement and camera controls, rather than this weird dual-stick steering setup. The game's physics engine is already loose enough that it doesn't need an unconventional control scheme to artificially bump up the difficulty. Similarly, I found the timer made the game more stressful than it needed to be. Some of the later levels get decently lengthy, and it was frustrating to play a level upwards of 15 minutes, only to then time out and have to start over again from scratch. Some games thrive off of their difficulty, but in a game as simple and cheery as this one, I was hoping for something more relaxing. The game's excellent presentation largely makes up for this though, with an eclectic and memorable soundtrack and simplistic but vibrant art style. It's a shame that the sequels aren't as widely available on modern platforms as this game is. This is my first time playing anything Katamari related, and I'd love to try some of the later entries if only to see more of this exclusively Katamari gameplay style. Trails in the Sky first chapter is the epitome of takes a while to get going. Like, I thought Rune Factory 4 was bad with its 5-hour slog of an intro, but this game is on another level. The story for this game doesn't start to get good until chapter 2, really chapter 3 because the prologue is as long as all of the other chapters. Which might not sound that bad, but when you take into account the fact that this 40-hour game only has 5 chapters, counting the prologue and finale, the prologue and first chapter amount to about 12 hours of gameplay. In other words, the story only gets good about 12 hours in. Even though the story does increasingly get better and better from chapter 2 onwards, I did have to dock points just for that fact. Now, you may ask, it's nice to know that the story gets good 12 hours in, but if it takes that long, why did you stick with it? To that, I'll say that the prologue and first chapter are each held up by a really strong character. For the prologue, that character is Estelle. Estelle is spunkier than the average shonen protagonist, having a lot of fun one-liners and just the right amount of energy so that she's fun to have on screen without being obnoxiously cheerful like so many other JRPG protagonists are. Sora. Which is good because she's the main character. She reminds me a bit of Sapphire from Pokemon Adventures, for anyone who gets that reference. The first chapter has Olivia to thank for its entertainment value. Olivia is pretty much just a D&D bard, and the fact that second chapter's Steam page advertises the sequel as having more Olivia in it should really be all I need to say to prove that he's a great character. The gameplay is great too. As someone who, despite playing a lot of RPGs, always manages to struggle on even the easiest difficulty mode, I inevitably ran into a lot of fights where I needed to adjust my strategy. When I did this, I realized something pretty cool about this game's combat. Nearly all of your arts and crafts are useful to some extent. I tried just spamming arts for the first couple hours, but eventually that stopped working, and that's when I realized that I needed to start using crafts more. Once I did that, I then started to realize that crafts are actually an ample source of useful AoE attacks. It was here when I started to appreciate the practicality of all of the moves that the game gives you. Even the weaker arts are still somewhat useful later in the game, because the late game arts tend to also be huge AoE attacks, and sometimes you just need a weaker attack for less EP to finish off a single enemy. Usually stronger magic attacks in JRPGs just replace the weaker ones, so this was a pleasant surprise. These factors that kept me going for the opening stretch of the game were of course still in place later in the game once the story started to pick up, so everything came together really nicely by the end. And I don't agree with the general consensus that this game's story is only good in that it leads into the next game's story. I felt that the political intrigue and strong character interactions developing from Chapter 2 onwards were compelling enough to justify the game as an individual experience, separate from whatever the rest of the series might contain. To continue with popular opinions I don't really agree with, I have to say I really wasn't a big fan of Joshua. At a number of points throughout the story, the guy displays a distinct and, considering that he's the game's deuteragonist, somewhat unsettling lack of empathy for others. He's not oblivious to this either. He goes out of the way to point this out to the rest of the party and the player. The game does sort of explain why he's like this at the very end, but it still doesn't make me like him anymore. Nor did I really like Charizard. She's a really bad mentor figure for Estelle, and the game uses her to make a lot of unfunny jokes. It doesn't really help that her name sounds like a Pokemon either. I did largely like the rest of the party though, and its strongest members, that being Estelle, Olivia, and Chloe, bring a lot to the game's writing. Also, even though he's not a party member, while we're talking about characters I don't like, man is Cassius the worst. Not only is he apparently on speaking terms with every important person in the country, but everyone who knows him seems to credit him for being just the gosh darn greatest guy who ever lived. Everyone, that is, but his own daughter, who he can't even really seem to be bothered to give the time of day. What a guy. On top of all that, he also has the world's stupidest looking mustache. As one final note, because I didn't know where else in the review to stick this, I really like this game's soundtrack. It's got a subtle jazz flair to it, and there are a lot of textures going on with the different instrument choices, which is pretty unusual for a video game soundtrack, especially one using synthesized instruments. Listen to the percussion on the Seaside Towns theme to see what I mean. At the risk of sounding a bit condescending, it makes me sad seeing all the people who drop or otherwise pass on CrisTales just because of some optimization issues. Yes, the loading screens are long and frankly excessive, but the game is by no means unplayable because of them, and they shouldn't stop you from playing such a charming and engaging RPG. For Pete's sake, every time I go to GameStop, I see it on clearance for $10. At that price, it's a steal! CrisTales was a game that was vaguely on my radar around the time it came out back in 2021, but as Neo The World Ends With You was releasing only a few weeks later, I didn't have the time to play it. I ended up getting it at the end of 2021 and finishing it early 2022, and I am so glad that I did. As many have pointed out, the main draw of CrisTales is its presentation. Art direction isn't really something I pay that much attention to unless it's really unique, and CrisTales definitely qualifies as one of those cases where it's really unique. It's probably a three-way tie between this, Cuphead, and The World Ends With You for my favorite art style in a video game. I'm serious, it's that good. To only mention the art style would be to only mention the obvious though, and presentation is so much more than just the obvious. For one, the game is fully voice acting, which is incredibly impressive for an indie game with this much dialogue. And the voice acting itself is all pretty good too. The soundtrack is also great, really nailing its relaxing town themes and dramatic battle tracks in particular. Of course, a large part of an RPG's appeal is in its writing, and on this front, CrisTales absolutely delivers. All of the party members manage to shine individually and in their interactions with others. Well, except for one spoiler character who was kind of lame, but 5 out of 6 ain't bad. With Zaz in particular being peak party member. Even the NPCs are great. There are at least 5 NPCs where at varying points I thought, man, I wish they would join the party. And I think that says a lot about the quality of the character writing. Similarly, the story really got its hooks in me around the middle of the game, where it starts setting up interesting plot threads and building up the lore. In that regard, the game's final hours were actually a bit disappointing, as a lot of these great plot threads are resolved a bit too quickly in a rush to get to the end of the game. As a result, they end up missing the opportunity to explore a lot of interesting implications that come from some of those plot threads. That being said, I don't think a slightly botched landing diminishes the quality of the setup, so I would still say that the story is one worth experiencing. CrisTales is a game I desperately want some kind of follow-up to. As far as I can tell, this is the first game by this dev team, and beneath the flaws they clearly show a ton of potential. It doesn't have to be a direct sequel, but if they retain the style that drew so many to the game while improving the performance and writing a more fleshed out finale, I believe they could have a truly special RPG on their hands. I have a lot of scattered thoughts on Xenoblade Chronicles 3, but I think the majority of them can be summed up by talking about the game in terms of the combat and the story. First, talking about the combat, it's amazing how Monolith Soft manages to outdo themselves each game. Well, maybe not outdo per se. It's going to be a hard fight for 3 to beat out 2 for my favorite combat system in a video game. But I just mean to say that miraculously, this game manages to increase the complexity of combat from 2 while keeping it satisfying and making it much more understandable. The best example of this are the chain attacks, which have been totally reformatted and are somehow even more complex than the ones in 2. Unlike in 2 though, chain attacks here aren't really about the setup, unless you mean how you set your party up before the battle. Instead, they're more about the order you unleash your attacks in, and the special ability of the hero you have equipped in order to maximize your TP output. There are some really wild hero abilities that situationally can give you crazy amounts of TP, and it's so satisfying when you unleash all your attacks in just the right order so that you can take full advantage of that. Additionally, and this might be a bit of a hot take, but the chain attack song is one of the best songs in the game, and I enjoyed hearing it every time it came on, and I will not accept criticism on that. For me personally, much like in 2, the way chain attacks are handled here is what makes combat so good, although, admittedly, sometimes the fact that they can last so long means they're maybe not as useful in shorter battles. However, that's not to overlook the hero system and unit customization. The hero system takes the blade system from 2 and completely fixes it by removing the gacha, its worst aspect, and replacing it with hero quests. These are essentially blade quests from 2, and the blade quests were some of the best quests in 2, so it's pretty much a win-win situation in my books. Plus, you get to use the classes of the heroes you recruit, tying into the unit customization. The earlier chapters of the game are filled with these slow tutorials, and it locks off certain abilities until you reach higher levels or story milestones, which is frustrating at first, but it serves a functional purpose. Namely, that by the time you have everything unlocked, you will fully understand the combat system and are able to customize to your heart's desire. And there really is a ton to customize. I personally like to make my build as balanced as I could, but I don't see any reason why you couldn't try min-maxing your characters or build gimmick sets around heroes' chain attack abilities to get those really big TP numbers. Anyway, all that to say that the combat is excellent. As for the story is the main thing that I come to the Xenoblade Chronicles series for, and so I was really excited to see how this one would play out. Unfortunately, I do have one pretty major gripe with the story, that being just how many plot threads it leaves unresolved. This isn't the fault of a forgetful writing department either. The game goes out of its way to point out how many of the plot points it leaves unresolved are in fact unresolved. The answers to these questions may not be essential to understanding the plot, which is why I wouldn't go as far to call the story incomplete, but they are big enough gaps in the lore to create some amount of annoyance in their absence. What makes this so disappointing is that while I certainly have faults with the other Xenoblade games, none of those complaints really have to do with the writing. The writing is by far my favorite part of this series, and so it's unfortunate when it doesn't deliver to its fullest capacity. On the bright side, the fact that the writers are aware of these gaps does mean that they're probably planning to answer most of them in the DLC. I'd be happy to see them answered, but does the DLC really need these questions to make it interesting? Surely Monolith Soft can come up with a good plot hook without them, or at the very least, they should only need one. That all being said, I can't by any stretch say that Xenoblade 3 has a bad story, because the writing of this game accomplishes something truly impressive. At the risk of sounding mildly pretentious, I think that the marker of a great piece of art is that it can make you feel something. There's a difference between a song that sounds sad and a song that makes you sad, and Xenoblade Chronicles 3 is a game that will make you feel sad. I'm not really someone who cries when playing video games, but there was a real pit in my stomach during some of the more emotional moments in Xenoblade Chronicles 3. It's probably the most emotional a video game has made me, and I mean, I can count the number of games that have made me genuinely emotional on my fingers, and they're all like 9s and 10s in my ratings book. So that's a real feat. When the characters feel bad, you feel bad, and I think the ability to make you not just sympathize but empathize with a group of characters is a real technical and artistic achievement. Oh yeah, also I forgot to mention all the cool quality of life features this game added. You can fight in water now! That's so cool! You have no idea how annoying it was to not be able to fight in water during all those Eretz Sea quests in Xenoblade 1. Oh my gosh, I'm so glad that they added that in. Additionally, you can finally see quest markers in other regions, and you can even pick up items while aggroed. Which again, this makes questing so much easier. I'm gonna do all the quests eventually, so, you know, this is just nice to have. Finally, the voice acting was great pretty much across the board. There was only one character in the whole game that I thought was only so-so, and even then, they weren't bad, just like, okay. Most of the voice actors in this game go above and beyond to really nail the emotion the plot is going for, and it really helps to tie all the scenes together. I haven't laughed this much at a game since I first played Earthbound. The sheer depths of chaos that some of the endings delve to are truly hilarious, the confusion ending being my personal favorite. Of course, mixed in with all the fun and games is some genuinely clever commentary, and even occasionally a vague sense of existential dread. See the escape pod ending, the insanity ending, and the Zending for more details. Despite being a strictly single-player game, it's even a fun one to play with friends, just to see their reactions. I have a hard time putting what I like about the Stanley Parable into words, but suffice it to say, it's definitely one worth playing, a real class act in video game writing. And I do recommend playing it as opposed to just looking up all of the endings, so that you get to discover what and where all the different choices are for yourself. Also Bucket. Overall, despite the release of Xenoblade Chronicles 3, this was a more low-key year for me in terms of gaming. I sort of wish I played more new games, because a lot of what people were talking about this year was admittedly kind of lost on me. The top 6 were the big highlights of my year. Katamari and the Stanley Parable were truly novel experiences. Rune Factory 5 and CrisTales were more along the lines of the traditional RPGs that I like to play. I'm excited to see where the Trails series goes as I get to the games that the fandom seems to hype up so much. And of course, I await the story synopsis of Xenoblade Chronicles 3 Story DLC with bated breath. In terms of what I'm looking forward to next year, I already mentioned Xenoblade Chronicles 3 Story DLC. Indie favorite Hypnospace Outlaw is supposed to be getting a sequel sometime soon. Other than that, as primarily a Nintendo player, next year is a fairly blank slate, so I'm excited to see what gets announced in the next few months. February Direct, here we come!